Greetings, quilters. We were looking on YouTube for a new project when we ran across this Eldon Quilt along Part 1 by Edita Sitar at Laundry Basket Quilts. Edita sells a kit and templates to make this quilt, and if you want to make an Eldon quilt, I would recommend buying her kit and templates for your first quilt. We bought the templates to make the 3 units needed to make this quilt. The template is used to cut and mark the parts so that each piece will be the correct size and shape. The marking holes in these templates will help with alignment and spacing of the pieces, as well as the starting and stopping points of the sewing path. We made a prototype of the block from our fabric stash, and it was successful, so we were ready to proceed with this new project. We used our EQ8 program to design the quilt. We use Excel to do the calculations for the different pieces. This calculation is for the strips needed to make the 8-point stars. A total of 64 strips are needed. 4 strips will be sewn together and then cut into 8 diamonds for a total of 128 diamonds. Okay, this calculation is for the different strips needed to make the 128 pieces of each size and color for the log cabin blocks. That's 1,664 pieces. This calculation is for the diamond pieces needed to complete the block, a total of 128 diamonds. This calculation is for the 9 connecting blocks made of 4 log cabins each. 9 of these blocks are needed to sew the 16-star octagonal blocks together. That's 146 pieces. Finally, we need triangles to fill the spaces between the quilt blocks. That's another 16 pieces. It's time to get started by selecting colors for our project. We were asked to use yellow, lavender, and lime green for the colors. Some of the colors that we had on hand just didn't work. Some of the colors worked fine, but we found that we needed a bigger variety of colors to get the effect we wanted. That's why it's best to buy the kit from Edita at Laundry Basket Quilts. So it was off to the fabric store to complete the colors needed. We start by ironing the fabrics. For small parts, we like to use a lot of starch to keep them from distorting during the handling and assembly. When cutting, it is always best to use a new or sharp blade. I like to use a weight to help keep the fabric from moving when cutting multiple strips from the same material. Using multiple rulers can keep the strips aligned for cutting. If you are careful, you can align the strips and cut them to make many pieces at the same time. Using a weight on a ruler to hold the strips from moving seemed to work well for this process. We keep the smaller pieces in Ziploc bags until they are needed. This will keep them from getting lost and wrinkled. We use large clips to keep the various colors of parts together. For the larger strips, we clip them together and hang them up to keep them from getting wrinkled. We tape the front edge of the piece of white template plastic to the sewing machine table. This facilitates moving smaller pieces of fabric to the feed dogs without disturbing the alignment of the pieces and makes it easy to change the bobbin. We positioned the template plastic and manually lower the needle through it. We use this hole as a guide to cut the hole for the feed dogs. We sew the diamond strip sets, starting with the darkest strip, working to the lightest strip. We stagger each consecutive strip about 3/4 of an inch. Incidentally, this is how we change the bobbin. We sew 2 strips together and then the other 2 strips, and then we sew these 2 sets together. Pressing the strip set is essential. The problem is we have to iron it to get it to lay flat. And if you do not iron carefully, you will stretch the strip set so that it is curved. We gently dry iron and then press to keep each strip set straight and flat. These are our green strip sets and lavender strip sets and yellow strip sets. When cutting the diamonds from the strip set, we need to align the template with the center of the strip. After cutting the diamonds, we need to trim them to the exact size using the template. We found that the template rested on the seams, leaving the fabric unsupported, and the cut was not as exact as we wanted it to be. To fix this problem, we folded painter's tape until it was about the thickness of the seams. We put that on another piece of tape and cut that into 4 strips. We taped that to the template so that it would hold the edges of the fabric while cutting. Now the template will hold the fabric edges in the cutting process, giving us cleaner and more accurate cuts. We found that turning the fabric over with the face side down and seams up gave us sharper edges. This is also a good time to mark the corners of each part. All of the diamonds are cut to size and marked ready to go. We store these parts in an out-of-the-way place until needed. Now it is time to make the diamonds to finish the quilt block. We always iron the fabric in the direction of the warp thread or parallel to the selvage edge. These parts need to be starched. Measure the width of the diamond template and then cut fabric strips to that width. We align and stack 4 strips together and cut the diamonds. Now all of the pieces are cut and ready to be sewn. The next step is to lay out the diamonds and arrange the various colors for each star. We move each star to the sewing machine. We lay the 2 adjacent pieces face to face, ready to be sewn. Before sewing, make sure that all pieces have been marked in all 4 corners using the template. Match the corner mark and sew from the edge of the corner point to the 1/4 inch mark, leaving space for the Y-seam. Sew all 4 sets together. Finger press all seams in the same direction. Place 2 of these sets face to face. Make sure that the seams nest together. Sew these starting on the seam. Do not start at the edge of the material. Sew to the mark, leaving a 1/4 inch space for the Y-seam. Trim the ears to reduce bulk in the center. Place the 2 halves face to face and nest the center seams. Start sewing from the center seam out to the edge. Leave a 1/4 inch for the Y-seam. Flip the unit over and sew overlapping the seam from the center out to the mark, leaving a 1/4 inch for the Y-seam. When you finish sewing the 2 halves together and you open the piece, the center seam should look like this. When you turn the piece over, the seam should come to the center similar to this. Now it is time to sew the log cabins together. We lay out all of the pieces in the order they will be sewn. The center of this block is a fussy cut part, so it is important to orient all of the center pieces the same way before sewing. To make sure that the seams of the log cabin blocks are flat, we found that pressing the seam open with our finger and then using a flat bottom object to press the seam flat worked best. We carefully trimmed the blocks that were just a bit out of square. By using the template and marking the 4 corners of the blocks still works just fine. Now is the time to press, not iron the finished blocks. There are 9 blocks used to join the octagonal blocks together. We were asked to include hummingbirds and dragonflies into the quilt, and this seemed to be a very good way to do it. We ordered some fabric with hummingbirds. We tried different layouts with chalk. We were able to cut the material so that we had hummingbirds facing 2 different directions. Fussy cut requires matching 2 exact points on each layer of fabric. Using a flathead pin makes the cutting process easier. We used a 2.5 inch square template to cut the birds out. If you nick a pin in the fussy cut process, your blade is ruined. We did not find the rotary mat very helpful for this process. We use this fabric to fussy cut centers for the other log cabin blocks. Before adding the log cabin blocks to the star block, make sure that the corners are marked. We now have all of the pieces needed, sewn and pressed, ready to complete the star blocks. We match the marks of the Y seam of the star with the marks on the log cabin block. We sew from the mark to mark. Be sure to leave the space for the Y seam needed to complete this block. When all the log cabin blocks are sewn into the block, it is a good time to finger press all of the seams in the correct direction. The final step to finish the block is to sew the diamonds in place. We match the Y seam marks of the log cabins with the mark on the diamond. The log cabin mark is on the underside. We sew from the center of the diamond to the outside of the diamond. It takes a little time to manipulate the fabric so that the other half of the diamond can be sewn. It is important not to sew over the folded piece underneath. We give the seams a final check to make sure that they are laying in the correct direction. We press from the seam side first. Most people just press the right side. And then we press the right side of the fabric for the final pressing. Now we need to cut 7 blocks to finish out the corners between the blocks. Cut 6 of the 7 blocks diagonally. Cut the remaining block diagonally in both directions. Mark each triangle using the template. Match the 1/4 inch mark on the triangle to the 1/4 inch mark on the block and sew one side of the triangle to the block. Square the block by sewing one of the 4 smaller triangles to the block. Now we need to make the 9 log cabin blocks that are used to join the octagonal blocks together. Each of the 9 blocks are made by sewing 4 log cabin blocks together. This is the last chance to check the layout of the quilt and make any adjustments wanted. Sew a log cabin block to each octagonal block. Add triangles as needed to start and finish the row. Finish sewing all of the blocks together to complete the row. We pin the adjacent diagonal row to the center row to help keep these 2 rows together while sewing them. When sewing the rows together, be sure to match the marks of the top and bottom layers. Remember, you're sewing Y seams. It is important to not sew over the points of the log cabin blocks of the top or the bottom layer. Match marks of the top and bottom layer, or match the points of the blocks of the top and bottom layer. Sewing these 2 layers together will make this quilt look sharp or not so sharp. So be very careful not to sew over the points. Continue adding the diagonal columns. This is the finished top. We clean up the edges of the quilt top. We want to show you the finished quilt. Thank you for watching, and we hope that you have enjoyed this presentation of making the Eldon quilt top. This is the back side of the quilt. We hope that it has given you some ideas to create your own quilt, whatever that may be. We have a presentation of how we finish and machine quilt this quilt in another video. It's called Eldon Quilt Part 2.